Christ according to Mark. Glory to you, Lord Christ. Jesus and his disciples came to Jericho. As he and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, a blind beggar, was sitting by the roadside. When he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to shout out and say, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." Many sternly ordered him to be quiet, but he cried out even more loudly, "Son of David, have mercy on me." Jesus stood still and said, "Call him here." And they called the blind man, saying to him, "Take heart, get up, he is calling you." So throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Then Jesus said to him, "What do you want me to do for you?" The blind man said to him, "My teacher, let me see again." Jesus said to him, "Go, your faith has made you well." Immediately he regained his sight and followed him on the way. The gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Christ. Please be seated. The National Center for Technology Information has published an article called "The Blind Have Superior Hearing." And in this article, they talk about neuroimaging and how blind people actually will adapt their brain so that the part that we normally use for vision becomes part of their sensory apparatus. It was 97 miles from Caesarea Philippi in the north of Israel to Jerusalem in the middle of Israel. Jesus in Caesarea Philippi, you may recall, had asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And after several of them stumbled around, Peter said, "You're the Messiah." Most of the rest of the disciples were clueless. And so as Jesus headed toward Jerusalem, he turned his head toward Jerusalem. He taught them on the way. You remember some of the lessons. They asked, "Who is the greatest of all?" And Jesus brought out a little child whose only warrant to greatness was that he was a child of God. And then last week we heard those wonderful characters, James and John, ask Jesus for seats on his right hand and on his left when he comes to glory. And once again, Jesus expounded on servant leadership. But most of the time, the most important lessons on this long trip from Caesarea Philippi to Jerusalem were Jesus' predictions that he was going to die. That in fact, the reason he was going to Jerusalem was to die. And the disciples just couldn't see it. Well, they got to Jericho. Jericho was about 15 miles from Jerusalem. And as they were going through and out of Jericho, a blind beggar named Timaeus couldn't see Jesus, but he heard his name. Now, there's a biology journal called PLOS, P-L-O-S, and it also has published a study on the acuity of blind person's hearing. They point out, for instance, the great musicians like Stevie Wonder. I didn't realize this. Stevie Wonder lost his sight when he was an infant in an incubator at the hospital with an oxygen overdose. Ray Charles lost his sight when he was a boy. He lost it to glaucoma. And of course, we know the great musical genius of those two. By the way, do you know that most piano tuners are blind? So this article also points out how blind people rearrange their brain and become more attuned. They actually become better linguistic than those of us with sight. Don't you wonder what Bartimaeus was hearing about Jesus piece by piece as pilgrims came into the range of hearing? Talked a little bit about Jesus and walked out of the range of his hearing. Bartimaeus probably heard words like rabbi, Savior, radical teacher and prophet, miracle worker. whatever pastiche of images Bartimaeus was picking up, they had the effect of giving him something that he had never had before. They gave him the effect of having hope. So when he heard that Jesus was passing by, very uncharacteristically for a blind person, he jumped up. He threw his cloak, was not a garment in fact, it was a little rectangular cloth that he spread in front of him for offerings. And he threw that away, almost as if his old life was going away when he was going to meet Jesus. And he said, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me, restore my sight. And Jesus said, now what is it you want? Oh, you want your sight restored? Your faith has made you well. And of course, then Bartimaeus followed Jesus on the way. We've been focusing on what Bartimaeus was hearing. But what do you think Jesus was hearing on his long journeys, those 3 years of his public ministry around the Holy Land? We know that often big crowds surrounded him. And crowds are kind of noisy, like the crowds at Norman last night until later in the game. People were coming to him to be healed. People were bringing others to him to be healed. And it must have been quite a sound. There was a wonderful rock opera called Jesus Christ Superstar. It was produced by Andrew Lloyd Webber in 1971. And one of the scenes in Jesus Christ Superstar is called The Temple. And in part of this scene, I think it gives us a real good idea of what Jesus might have been hearing. Let's listen to it. Out of that cacophony of pleas for healing, demands for healing, did you hear Jesus say, there's too many of you. There's too little of me. Well, we don't know there in Jericho if the din of noise was like that with Jesus at that particular time. But when he heard blind Bartimaeus get up and say, Jesus, son of David, have mercy on me. Do you remember what he did? He stood still. What was it about blind Bartimaeus that brought Jesus to a halt? Well, unlike the other disciples, the ones who could see, they had never understood what Bartimaeus, with his acuity of understanding, as he picked up this piece about Jesus and that piece about Jesus, as people walked by him, that Jesus was the Son of David, that he was the Messiah. He was not only the one that would bring healing to Bartimaeus, but he was the one who would bring healing to the whole world, indeed, to you and me. When Bartimaeus approaches Jesus, Jesus asks him a very simple question. What do you want me to do for you? Now, I think Jesus is, was, and always will be the most intuitive person that ever walked on this planet. And I can tell you that Bartimaeus must have looked the part. He must have looked like he was a blind beggar. Unlike Al Embry's assertion, this is not a caricature of me. This is a cartoon of Bartimaeus. So it must be clear to Jesus what Bartimaeus is and what he needs. And we know that Jesus never encountered brokenness and disease and hurt without rejecting it, denying it, and healing it. But Jesus wanted something else. He wants something else for you and me. He wants to enter into relationship. He wants a full dialogue of relationship and of give and take. Now look, that's why he invites us to pray in his name. He wants us to name our needs. He wants us to answer that simple question. What do you want me to do for you? And when we do that, it's not that Jesus doesn't know what we need long before we ask, but it opens up avenues of healing and blessing that weren't there before. So Bartimaeus says, restore my sight. And Jesus says, go, Your faith has made you well. But Bartimaeus does not go. He could have gone home to tell his family and his friends, look, I can see for the first time in my life. But he didn't. He followed Jesus. And what amazing first sights he must have had. Do you suppose that Bartimaeus was in Jesus' entourage as Jesus entered the city of Jerusalem? And the crowd shouted, "Hail to the King!" and threw down their palms on that occasion that we mark as Palm Sunday. Do you suppose that Bartimaeus was at the trial when Pontius Pilate condemned Jesus to be crucified? Do you suppose that Bartimaeus was on Calvary Hill with his eyes newly seen, blurred again with tears as he watched his master die? Do you think Bartimaeus saw the resurrected Jesus? We don't know. But I think so. I looked for something that would capture the pathos of Bartimaeus' situation, the exaltation of the miracle, the great love that Jesus showed to Bartimaeus and showed to you and me. And I found a gospel song by a man named Dave Bishop with his group appropriately named the Bishops. So let's listen to this and see if this doesn't fill in a few of the corners here in our story. I think it's worth a 99-cent investment in iTunes to hear Blind Bartimaeus. Blind Bartimaeus standing on the way, and Mary's baby, healing him like a natural man.